There are moments that stop you completely, not slowly, not with any warning at all. Just one moment everything looks familiar, and the next, something has shifted in a way that you cannot quite name. And the silence that follows that shift, that is where the real story always begins. Joel Whedon has stood at the center of one of the most watched, most debated, most quietly powerful pulpits in the world for more than 2 decades. Millions of people wake up on Sunday mornings and reach for the remote before they have even had their coffee, just to hear his voice. That smile, warm, steady, almost impossible to look away from, has become one of the most recognized faces in all of American religion. His books have moved through tens of millions of homes. His church fills an arena that once echoed with basketball crowds and championship energy. And yet, for all of that visibility, for all of that reach, something about Joel Osteen has always remained just slightly out of focus, just beyond what the camera fully captures. And then something shifted, not in the way things usually drift, not in the slow, almost invisible way that public figures tend to fade or change. This was different. This felt considered. This felt like a man who had been standing at the top of something vast and extraordinary, and had looked out at everything ahead of him, and had seen something that quietly changed the way he calculated the future. People who pay close attention noticed it first in the small things, a different weight in certain sentences, a pause where there used to be a pivot, a moment of stillness where the message used to rush forward, and then came the announcement. And when it arrived, it did not land the way anyone expected, not his most devoted supporters. Not his sharpest critics, not even the people who had spent years sitting closest to him. Some reached for the word courage, some reached for the word strategy. Some simply went quiet because they did not yet have the right word at all. But nearly everyone who heard it agreed on one thing. Joel Osteen's future, the one that seemed so settled and so certain, had just taken a turn that no one saw coming. And the question that surfaced afterward was not the loud, argumentative kind. It was quieter than that, softer, more honest, the kind of question that most people eventually ask themselves when the life they built starts asking something back. What does a man do when the path he spent everything constructing no longer looks the same from where he stands? To understand where Joel Osteen finds himself now, you have to resist the urge to start with the arena. You have to resist the bestseller lists and the television contracts and the stadiums full of people. You have to go back further, back to a smaller room, a quieter season. Back to a young man who, by his own honest admission, never planned to be the face of anything. Joel grew up inside his father's world, but always slightly behind it. John Osteen was the builder, the visionary, the preacher who started Lakewood Church with almost nothing, in a converted feed store on the edges of Houston, Texas, where the buildings were modest and the congregation was small and the faith was everything. John was the one who stood in the light. Joel, for nearly 2 decades, was the one who made sure the light was working. He handled the television production. He managed the equipment. He checked the cameras, adjusted the framing, ensured that everything his father needed was in place before the broadcast began. For 17 years, he operated almost entirely out of view, and he seemed, by most accounts, completely comfortable there. There is something in that detail that stays with you if you let it. A man who would eventually become one of the most visible religious figures on the entire planet spent the better part of his adult life choosing invisibility, choosing the background, choosing the work that nobody applauds. Then, in January of 1999, John Osteen became ill. The illness moved more quickly than the family had expected. And in the final week of his father's life, Joel was asked to step forward and preach, just once, just to fill a Sunday. It was the first sermon he had ever delivered. He was 35 years old, and by every account, including his own, he was not prepared for what happened next. The congregation responded in a way that surprised everyone in that room. There was something in how he spoke, something natural and unforced, that connected with people immediately. Within weeks of his father's passing, Joel had stepped into the role that no one, least of all himself, had anticipated for him. He became the senior pastor of Lakewood Church. And what unfolded after that was not a slow, careful climb. It was something closer to a tide coming in, sudden and powerful, and larger than anything a person could reasonably have planned for. Under his leadership, Lakewood grew into something genuinely unprecedented in American religious life. In 2003, the church purchased the Compact Center in Houston, the building where the Houston Rockets had once played to sold-out crowds, and began a years-long transformation that turned it into one of the largest church facilities anywhere in the United States. When the renovation was complete, the space could hold more than 16,000 people, and every single week it filled. His television ministry reached hundreds of millions of homes. His first book, Your Best Life Now, did not simply land on religious bestseller lists. It became a genuine cultural moment, the kind that crosses over into mainstream conversation and stays there. He appeared on the biggest talk shows. He sat across from major newspaper columnists and network anchors. He was praised with enormous warmth and criticized with enormous force. Sometimes in the same week, and through all of it, he kept showing up with that same steady presence. That same composed and almost unhurried calm. For years, that pattern held, and most of the world simply assumed it always would. But patterns are not the same as permanence. And Joel Osteen, moving now through his 60s, had quietly, privately been sitting with some things, turning them over. Looking at them from different angles in the early morning hours, before the cameras came on and the Sunday energy began to build. Something was being reconsidered. And the world would not have to wait much longer to feel it. For a long time, everything in Joel Osteen's world moved in one direction and one direction only. Forward, upward, wider, larger. Lakewood Church, by the time the 2010s had fully arrived, was not functioning simply as a congregation anymore. It had become something closer to a living institution, with all the weight and responsibility that word implies. The weekly attendance numbers were unlike anything most American churches had ever seen. The television reach extended into corners of the globe that most pastors spend entire careers simply dreaming about. The books kept coming, and they kept reaching people. The speaking events filled arenas that had nothing to do with religion, and everything to do with the simple fact that people wanted to be in the same room as this particular voice. And through all of that, Joel maintained something that, in retrospect, is actually quite remarkable. A consistency of persona. The warmth never flickered, the message never lurched. The tone stayed centered on the same essential belief, that hope was available, that better days were not just possible but promised. That God was not withholding good things from the people who trusted and believed. Critics labeled it the prosperity gospel and argued, loudly and persistently, that it reduced faith to a transaction. Supporters said it had changed their lives in ways they could not fully articulate. The debate moved in circles year after year and never quite resolved. But whatever people said about the theology, the scale of the operation was not something anyone could argue away. Lakewood's reported annual revenue moved through the tens of millions. Hundreds of staff members worked within its walls. Community programs ran across Houston, food distribution, outreach initiatives, support services for families in need. Whatever else was said about the institution, it was doing the tangible, difficult work of being present in a city. And Joel himself had prospered in ways that were plainly visible. A large home in one of Houston's most affluent areas, private travel, a life that in its material shape reflected the very message he preached from the platform. That reality generated its own ongoing debate, one that never fully quieted. Through all of it, he remained composed, remarkably almost stubbornly composed. He did not raise his voice in interviews. He did not engage directly with his critics in the combative, point-by-point way that the internet often demanded. He kept the same steady rhythm, Sunday after Sunday, book after book, city after city. The machine, if you want to call it that, ran with an almost unsettling smoothness. But inside any machine that runs long enough at that temperature, things begin to shift. Small things first, a little friction here, a question that does not go away there. And a man who has been performing at that level, in that light, for more than 20 years, eventually finds himself in a quiet moment asking something he cannot easily unknow. Is this still what I want it to be? Is this still what it was always supposed to be? Those questions, if Joel was carrying them, he kept close. That had always been his way, to process privately and present publicly only what was ready to be seen. But answers, when they begin to form, eventually find their way to the surface. It started, for many people watching from the outside, with a storm. In August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey came ashore along the Texas coast and then, almost incomprehensibly, simply stopped moving. It stalled directly over Houston for days. The rainfall was historic. Streets became rivers. Entire neighborhoods went underwater. Tens of thousands of people lost everything they had in a matter of hours. The city, one of the largest in the United States, was in a state of genuine, visible, overwhelming crisis. And in the middle of all of that, Lakewood Church, sitting in its enormous facility, on ground that was higher than much of the surrounding area, initially did not open its doors as a shelter. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Social media moved faster than the floodwaters. Images of the church's closed exterior circulated alongside images of families wading through chest-deep water, with children held above their heads. National news outlets picked up the story within hours. The intensity of the criticism was unlike anything Lakewood or Joel had faced before, and it came from people who had previously had no strong opinion about the church one way or the other. The church did eventually open. Officials explained that the delay was tied to safety evaluations and the logistics of preparing a facility of that size to receive thousands of displaced people. Joel appeared publicly to address the situation and to document the relief work the church was undertaking. The explanation was not entirely unreasonable. The full picture was genuinely more complicated than the initial headlines captured, but something had already changed in how a portion of the public understood the institution. The hurricane episode did something that years of theological debate had not been able to accomplish. It made Lakewood feel fallible in a very specific, very human way. It raised a question that is harder to dismiss than any argument about prosperity theology. What does a church of this size actually owe the city it lives inside? Joel never answered that question in the direct, sustained way that his critics were hoping for, but the question itself did not leave. It settled into the background of his public story like something permanent, always there, rarely named, never fully resolved. And as the years continued to pass, that question was joined by others that were forming across the broader landscape of American evangelical Christianity. A reckoning was underway. Not at Lakewood specifically, but across the world that Lakewood was part of. Accusations of abuse, financial opacity, and spiritual manipulation were surfacing in congregation after congregation, denomination after denomination. The trust that many people had extended to large religious institutions, often for their entire lives, was fracturing in real time. The scrutiny was everywhere, and it was not gentle. Lakewood was not at the center of those particular storms, but the climate had changed in ways that could not simply be waited out. The entire environment that Joel inhabited was being examined under a harder, more skeptical light. And a man as perceptive as he had always proven himself to be could not have been unaware of what that meant, or what it was going to continue to demand. Somewhere in that shifting landscape, something inside the ministry began to change as well. People who had been following Joel Osteen's sermons for years, not casually but closely, week after week, began to notice something in the early part of the 2020s that was difficult to name precisely, but was impossible to ignore once you had spotted it. The language was moving, not in any sudden or dramatic direction. There were no declarations, no abrupt theological pivots, nothing that would have made a headline on its own. But the emphasis was different. Suffering was being acknowledged more directly and held longer before the message turned toward resolution. There were sermons that sat inside difficulty with more patience than before. The turn toward hope, when it came, felt earned in a way that carried more weight than the smooth, reliable optimism that had defined the earlier years. For a preacher whose entire public identity had been constructed on the foundation of relentless, forward-moving hope, even a subtle change in that direction was significant. Some of it clearly was the pandemic. COVID-19 forced Lakewood to close its physical doors and move entirely into an online format for a sustained and disorienting stretch of time. Joel Osteen preaching to a camera inside an empty arena that normally held 16,000 people. That image alone captures something of what that period must have felt like. A ministry built on the energy exchange between a preacher and a live crowd, suddenly stripped of the crowd entirely. That kind of experience does not leave a person unchanged. But it was not only the pandemic. Joel was moving deeper into his 60s. Both of his parents were gone. The abstract awareness of mortality that exists for most people in their earlier decades had become something more concrete, more present, more personal. And the questions that accompany that shift, about legacy, about whether the thing you built actually reflects what you most deeply believed, about whether there is still time to close the gap between those two things if the answer is no. Those questions do not stay in the background once they have been honestly invited in. In certain interviews during this period, there were moments where Joel seemed to reach past his usual, carefully maintained framework for something less finished. Not a collapse. Nothing so theatrical, just flashes. Moments where the man who had spent decades presenting a polished and complete version of his message seemed to be working something out in real time, in front of whoever was watching. The hope was still there, it was not going away. but it had acquired something around it, a texture, a weight, a kind of honest complexity that had not always been visible before. And then, without quite the fanfare that might have been expected, the announcements began to arrive. According to multiple reports and statements that surfaced in public forums, Joel Osteen began signaling something that those who knew his history found genuinely surprising: a willingness to reconsider the shape of his role, and the shape of Lakewood itself, in ways that went well beyond routine organizational planning. Questions around succession had been circulating for some time. What happens to a ministry that has been built so completely around one particular personality, one particular voice, one particular smile? When that person begins to consciously create space between themselves and the center. It is not a simple logistical question. It is an existential one for any institution that has organized itself so thoroughly around a single human presence. Joel had spoken publicly in various settings and over various years about his son Jonathan, a younger Osteen who had been stepping into increasingly visible roles within the church's life and ministry. But according to those familiar with the internal conversations, what was being considered was something that extended beyond a conventional transfer of leadership. What was being discussed, according to these accounts, was closer to a fundamental reimagining, a genuine reconsideration of what the ministry was actually for, what it should look like, and what relationship it should have to the community and the world around it. For an institution operating at Lakewood's scale, that kind of conversation is not a small or contained thing. It touches everything simultaneously: the programming and its direction, the financial structures and how they function, the hundreds of people who work there and depend on it, the theological emphasis that has defined the church's public identity for a generation, the relationship with the city of Houston, which has been complicated and significant in equal measure, the television ministry that reaches into homes across the globe. All of it at once becomes subject to the same question. If the center shifts, what holds? No definitive public declaration had been made, no precise timeline had been established. But people who were paying careful attention to the direction of the movement could see that something substantive was in motion. Not a retreat, not a crisis. Something more deliberate than either of those things. A reckoning undertaken by choice at a moment of the chooser's own selecting. There is a very particular kind of weight that settles on a person when the thing they built has grown into something their original vision never fully accounted for. Joel Osteen walked into the senior pastor role at Lakewood in 1999 with no theological training and no preaching experience, and a grief that was still completely fresh. What he carried was a father's legacy, a congregation's need, and some instinct he had never had occasion to fully test before. What he built over the 25 years that followed was something that dwarfed anything anyone in that converted feed store on the outskirts of Houston could have imagined. A global media presence, a community institution embedded in one of America's largest cities, a theological brand that had entered mainstream cultural consciousness. A reference point that people used in conversation after conversation to talk about what American Christianity had become. None of that was the result of a master plan. It emerged from talent and timing and personality. And something else that resists easy description, a particular quality of warmth and accessibility that translated across every medium and every cultural context in which it was placed. And now, moving through his 60s, Joel stood in relationship to all of that in a way that was genuinely and honestly complex. He was still its center. His voice was still the reason the broadcast existed. His presence was still the organizing principle around which everything else arranged itself every single week. But he was also, by every indication available, a man who had begun to look at that center differently, not with the clean, simple emotion of regret. That word would be too small and too final for what this appeared to be, more like an honest, sustained reassessment. The kind that only becomes fully possible after enough time has accumulated to give a person the perspective they could not have had while they were in the middle of building everything. According to those with knowledge of his conversations and his thinking during this period, Joel had been engaging with questions about the church's direction that went deeper than structure or succession planning. What was the actual mission, when you stripped away the brand and the scale and the television contracts and the bestseller rankings? What was Lakewood genuinely called to do inside its city, inside a world that looked dramatically different from the one that existed in 1999? Were their communities being missed? Were their needs going unaddressed that an institution with this level of resource and this level of reach had a genuine moral responsibility to engage? These were not the questions of exhaustion. They were the questions of a man trying, seriously and honestly, to close the gap between what something had become and what it had always been meant to be. And running underneath all of it, quieter than the rest, was something more personal than any of the institutional considerations. The recognition that time is not unlimited. That the window for meaningful change does not stay open indefinitely. That if something is going to look different in the way it most needs to, not cosmetically, not for appearances, but in its actual substance and direction, then the decision to begin that change has to happen now and not at some comfortable future point that has not yet arrived. Joel Osteen, through all the noise and debate and controversy and celebration that has surrounded him for a quarter century, had arrived at a moment that is, at its core, profoundly ordinary. Profoundly humans. The moment when a person looks honestly at the life and the work they have constructed, sets aside the performance and the audience and the expectation, and asks the question that is the hardest one of all. Is this what it was supposed to be? And if not, what do I do now while I still have time? That question does not come with a prepared answer. It never does. But the willingness to ask it, openly and without the protection of a guaranteed outcome, is its own kind of turning point. The kind that tends to matter more in the long run than any of the more visible ones. There is a version of this story, clean and simple and satisfying in its clarity, where Joel Osteen is cast as either a saint or a cautionary tale. Where Lakewood is either a model of what religious community can accomplish, or a symbol of everything that has gone wrong with institutional faith in America. Where every choice he has made is either obviously righteous or obviously suspect, and where the narrative wraps up neatly in one direction or the other. That version is always available. It is a popular version. It gets a lot of engagement. But there is another version, harder to hold, that insists on keeping all of the contradictions in the room at the same time. The genuine, documented good that Lakewood's community programs have done for real people in a real city. The legitimate, serious questions that remain about how wealth and faith interact inside an institution of this magnitude. The complicated truth of a man who entered one of the most demanding public roles imaginable without preparation, and who has been navigating its particular weight in plain view of everyone. Ever since. Joel Osteen is not a figure who resolves easily. He has never been. The qualities that make him genuinely effective, the warmth that does not appear performed, the optimism that does not appear fragile. The refusal to be pulled into the kind of public combat that the internet perpetually invites, are the same qualities that make him deeply frustrating to the people who want a harder, more confrontational engagement with difficult questions. He contains contradictions, as nearly every person of substance does. The difference is that his contradictions have been performed, every week, for more than 2 decades, in front of an audience that runs into the millions. And now, at a point in his life when many public figures of comparable stature are simply consolidating what they have already built and waiting for history to render its verdict. Joel Osteen appears to be doing something that is, in its own quiet way, more interesting than that. He appears to be genuinely asking what comes next, not in the sense of planning the next book or the next initiative, but in the deeper sense, the personal sense. The sense that has less to do with the institution and more to do with the man inside it. That is a more human story than the one that usually gets told about him. Whatever the announcement ultimately comes to mean, whatever the restructuring looks like when it has taken its final shape, whatever the next chapter of Lakewood actually becomes, the most compelling detail is not the outcome. The most compelling detail is the posture. The willingness to stand at the edge of something enormous that you built with your own hands, something that has carried both great good and serious questions, and to say, without the safety of a predetermined answer, I am not done asking what this should be. That requires a different kind of courage than the courage it took to build it. And whether you have found meaning in Joel Osteen's message, or whether you have spent years arguing that the message itself is the problem, that particular moment, the moment of honest and unprotected reconsideration, is one that crosses the boundaries of faith and skepticism both. Because most people, at some point, find themselves standing in front of something they have made and feeling simultaneously proud of it, and uncertain about it, and aware that there may still be time to make it more fully what it was always supposed to be. That is where Joel Osteen appears to be standing right now, Not at an ending, not at a triumphant culmination. Somewhere more honest and more uncertain than either of those. In the space between what has been and what might still be possible, watching the distance, measuring the gap, and by every account that has surfaced, not finished yet. If this story moved something in you, whether it was about faith or legacy, or simply the very human experience of looking honestly at a life you have built, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Every response matters and every perspective adds something real to the conversation. And if you want to stay with us for stories told this way, stories that take their time and look for the person beneath the public figure, then subscribe and keep close. There is always more worth understanding, and we are not finished either.